All right. Well, folks, guess what? We're on chapter 5.
Hallelujah.
At this rate,
Moving right along.
we will finish the book of Genesis sometime about the end of the tribulation. What's that?
Don't worry about it with the rapture coming, I guess.
All right. But makes you wonder, though. You know, the Bible tells us that the time will come. In fact, we've already studied this in the past, that the time will come when no one will have to be taught because everybody will know Jesus. But you wonder, okay, how does that apply to those that are born during the millennial kingdom period? Because they have to be taught. So are we the ones that's going to do that? Will God miraculously instill within them a natural understanding of who He is? Or are there still going to be preachers and teachers and, churches? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how worship pans out, worship and discipleship during that period of time.
I think it'd be difficult for anybody growing up in that time not to know who the king of the world is.
Mm-hmm. But clearly there will be some who even then will say they're not interested. All right, chapter 5. Now, I know this is also going to be a great shock to many of you, but I'm pretty sure we're actually going to get through the entirety of chapter 5 in one sitting, because chapter 5, now, let me see.
32 verses, come on.
Yeah, well, this is, and I'm going to teach you a new theological term here. Now, there will not be a test later, so. What's that?
A genealogy, I hope not.
No. Well, sorta. A toledot. If you, in your studies, if any of you read behind, additional commentaries, you've seen that word before?
No, she can't see it.
Oh, okay.
Toledot.
Yeah, it looks like toledot, but toledot. That basically is the theological term for,
Toledo
guess
T.
what? A genealogy.
It's a Toledo T.
Yeah.
Toledo, Ohio. See, Toledo T?
Yeah,
I
okay.
just break it down differently than you do.
If Larry's not here, it's like you just sort of
Feels right.
rise to the
I gotta
surface.
fill the void when Larry's gone, so.
All right. Yeah, it's called a toledot. It's a theological term for a genealogy. And I know that's not really important in the greater scheme of things. It's not going to change how we view this. I throw these things out because if you do any additional studying or if you read any commentaries on this stuff, you will come across that term and you'll look at it and go, what in the world is a toledot? Now you know a toledot is the theological term for a genealogy. So every time you see a list of names or, and believe it or not, we've actually already been through about 3 of these in the previous 4 chapters when it talks about the line of Cain, the line of Adam. All of those are referred to as toledots. Well, now we see the most exhaustive one that we have been given so far here in chapter 5. And no, I'm not going to read every single part of this because it is a, one generation after another. But part of this actually is important. So anyway, verse 1, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Now right off the bat, what happened to the book of the generations of Adam? Or if you look in some translations, of course, it'll say this is the scroll or this is the record. Of course, they didn't have books back then, but you have to wonder, was there some record that Moses used to record this from? We don't know. If there was such a thing, it doesn't exist anymore, at least not that we have access to. In the day when God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. Now, by the way, this is yet another creation account. This is about the 3rd one we've run into. All right, verse 2 says, He created them male and female, and He blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. Now notice here, this includes Eve. Eve also comes under the heading of being called by God Adam or Adam. Now later we see that God referred to Adam in that way and actually gave him the name Adam. But the Hebrew word Adam also applies to Eve.
So is it like person? It's a generic?
It's generic. Well, the closest word, the best translation to that in English would be human.
Okay.
Not just man, but human. All right. Verse 3 says, When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Now, notice at this point, now we know that Adam and Eve already had 2 kids, which was Cain and Abel. And there is some possibility they may have been twins, although we don't know that for sure. It is unlikely, in fact, I'd say virtually a certainty, that Seth was not just another kid somewhere down the line, but probably their 3rd one. How do we know that would be the case?
Because they would have outlined it.
Because we were told he was given by God as a replacement for Abel.
Exactly. There you go. That would be it. Because if they had other sons and daughters before this, you would think that Eve would consider one of them to have been the promised child. But apparently not. And it's also interesting that Abel was not the firstborn, yet Eve apparently considered him to be the child of promise until Cain murdered him. And he wasn't the firstborn. And again, even if they were twins, we definitely are told that Cain was the one born first. All right, but now notice at this point, even if they had, whether she had 2 pregnancies or just one, I mean, it really doesn't matter for where I'm going with this. Notice Adam is 130 years old at this point before he has a 3rd son. Now, what does that tell us about the lifespan of humanity at that point?
It was really long.
Well, not just really long, but apparently, well, let's face it. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, I was gonna say they're young like. They're not old.
Well, biologically, you know, everybody in here knows that a woman can only get pregnant at certain times during the month. And God, on 2 separate occasions, once before they fell, and then he reiterated this after the fall, just to let Adam and Eve know that rule had not changed. They were told, be fruitful and multiply. Now, if nature had simply taken its course and they'd just done what married people do, guess what? She should have had 100 kids by this point. But notice, only 3. So what does that tell us? Not only was the lifespan itself greatly elongated, but apparently just the so-called cycle of life itself, as far as how our bodies work, all apparently much slower.
Don't you think some of this was time to think about how they'd messed up as well? That God chose to not allow them to have more children until they, I guess, maybe came to grips with.
Maybe, but the problem with that would be that God had specifically told them to have kids.
Well, obviously they messed it up, so.
And I think he's got a good point. At the rate that people are capable of having kids now in our short lifespans,
Yeah.
if they were having kids at that rate, they'd have had thousands of kids by the time they were 100.
Right.
You know, they'd have had 20,000 kids
In
by the time they were
130
500,
years,
you know.
that they had kids, the kids had kids, the kids' kids had kids. There'd have been several thousand people on the earth in that 130-year period. But apparently not. You got Adam, Eve, Cain, and Seth. And if they, of course, they may have had a daughter or 2 by this particular point. I'd say it's a good possibility that they may have had a daughter, because otherwise, if Cain by this point has already been run off, we know Cain had a wife, so she probably has had a daughter. So we're still only looking at maybe 3, at most 4 pregnancies during this period of time in 130 years. So instead of, having a monthly time where they can get pregnant, maybe they could only get pregnant like once a year at this point. I mean, all we can do is speculate. But I guess the point I'm making is that not just the lifespan itself was greatly, longer than what we see today, but the whole cycle of nature itself was apparently much slower. Because, let's face it, you put 2 people together and give them 130 years, they're going to have kids.
You think this is proportional to as evil goes up in the world, all these cycles got smaller too?
And that's a possibility. All right. Verse 4 says, Then the days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Now, this is the one where, again, people say, oh, well, they didn't have any kids. Well, we don't know how many they had, because the verse 4 just simply says he had sons and daughters. We don't know how many. We're just not told that. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And by the way, I'm not going to do this, but if we were to map out, okay, from the day of creation, Adam lived, 930 years. Then he had Seth, and we see Seth lived this many years and what have you. If we mapped all that out, the overwhelming majority of people before the flood would have actually been alive during Adam's lifespan. Adam would have been alive to see the world populated with his descendants and to get a real good view of what his sin did for the world. Now, he did die before the flood, but not that far in advance of the flood. Verse 6 said, Seth lived 105 years, and he became the father of Enosh. Not Enoch, mind you, but Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth, 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 90 years, and he became the father of Kenan. Enosh lived 815 years after he became the father of Kenan, and he had other sons and daughters. So I'm not going to read every single one of these. Every one of them is the same concept. Enosh, 905 years. Kenan, 70 years. Then Mahalo, Kenan lived 840 years. He had other sons and daughters. Verse 14, the days of Kenan, 910 years. You're seeing definitely a pattern here that the average age of humanity is a little better than 900 years. Now, I'm going to throw something out here. Don't read too much into this. What I'm fixing to tell you is nothing but pure speculation on my part. I'm just wondering, because the Bible does not say this, so we can't say, oh, this is what happened. I'm just wondering. But what did Peter say about time with regard to God?
Day is a 1,000 years.
Yeah, 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Notice God told Adam in the day he ate the fruit what would happen.
You will surely die.
That day. Notice how long they lived. Just a hair short of 1,000 years.
Which is just a hair short of a day to the Lord.
A hair short of a day to the Lord. Now again, we can't make that conclusion, dogmatically, but you have to wonder, is there some, relationship there between the amount of time God allowed them to live and what he had told Adam, comparing that with what Peter said about, time with regard to God. If he's allowing them to live just a hair short of what Peter said would be a day to God.
God speaks the truth.
Mm-hmm.
When he said you will surely die this day, he meant it.
Yeah. So like I said, we don't know for sure. That's just speculation and, wondering on my part, but
You never know.
something at least worth thinking about. Or not. All right. Now, the rest of it pretty much just says the same thing all the way down until we get to verse 19. In 19 it says, and Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Now notice, Enoch is the exception to the rule in several ways. Most of the rest of these guys didn't even have their first child until they're over 100 years old. Enoch's only 65. And he's given or fathered Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah. So he lived 365 years. And then verse 24 says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now, notice how it describes Enoch in verse 24. It doesn't say that he walked after God or that he followed God. That the phrase here is he walked with God. It's actually different the way it describes some of the others. For example, even in Abraham. Abraham is never described as walking with God. It says Abraham followed God, he trusted God, but Enoch we see that he says he walked with God. And by the way, even though it does not specifically state that here, what do we know about Enoch and his relationship? Not only does he walk with God, but what else was Enoch? What made Enoch stand apart from some of the other people in this genealogy?
He didn't live as long.
Well, didn't live as long, but Enoch didn't die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what else?
He didn't die.
He walked with God.
Enoch was a prophet. Skip over to the Epistle of Jude, which is just before Revelation.
Enoch.
Finding in this
All right.
tabs and stuff.
Verse 14.
Yeah. Now, in
14.
Jude, what's that?
Verse 14.
Yep. Which chapter? Yeah. Okay, verse 14. And about these also Enoch in the seventh generation from Adam prophesied. So what does that tell us about Enoch versus the rest of them? Enoch is a pre-flood prophet. As far as we know, about the only one that we even know of. And, of course, we have no written prophecies left behind from him. Now, how in the world Jude or anybody then knew about it, we have no way of knowing unless Christ told them. Because, of course, Jude knew Jesus, so, Jesus may have explained to them what Enoch prophesied about. But why do you suppose that Enoch would not have left behind any written prophecies?
Because
flood?
of
The flood! There was this thing
Unless
that
Noah had them on the ark.
there was this big disaster that unless Noah had a copy of it on the ark, it would not have survived unless God miraculously, saved it. And since Enoch was the prophet to the pre-flood people, would we necessarily have needed a copy of whatever he prophesied about? We're apparently told all that we need to know about his prophecy there with Jude. Now, yes, as I mentioned, and just as a reminder, because I'm not going to go into detail about it again, but I mentioned to you on Wednesday that yes, there are these what's called apocryphal, which basically means they're out there, but they're not considered inspired works of Scripture. these apocryphal works by Enoch that we know were not in fact written by Enoch. They carry Enoch's name, but Enoch didn't write them because, again, they were not available to the Jews. They did not, any writings that he might have had did not survive the flood as far as we know. And we know that the so-called Book of Enoch, there is no Hebrew version of it available. So we're fairly certain that if you look up or do a Google search for the Book of Enoch, you will find it, but it wasn't written by the real Enoch, at least as far as we know.
My commentary says perhaps this is an indication that idolatry was emerging, but Enoch lived in strict compliance to the will of the true God.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say it's a pretty good bet, no matter whether it was idolatry or not, that Enoch definitely lived according to the will of God. Now, another thing about Enoch, as we continue on, where were we here? Yeah, it's in verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's all it says about him. Doesn't say that he died, just says God took him. Now, I am absolutely convinced that of the two witnesses that we are told about in the book of Revelation, we know one of those is Elijah. Basically because the Bible tells us that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, Elijah will return. But there's been speculation for years about what's the identity of the other one. The two popular opinions are Enoch or Moses. I'm convinced it's Enoch for this reason. The Bible tells us it is appointed for man to do what?
Once died.
Wants to die. Now we know there are a few notable exceptions to that. For example, Lazarus. Lazarus died, and God Himself not resurrected. That wasn't because that would have made Lazarus the firstborn of the resurrection, which he was not. It was a resuscitation. He was brought back to life in his physical body. There's a few others. The Apostle Paul,
Jairus'
brought-
daughter.
Yeah, Jairus' daughter that Jesus resuscitated. When Elisha, the body of Elisha was thrown down into the pit, to bury him, he fell onto the bones of some previously dead bodies, and what happened to them? They came to life as soon as Elisha's dead body touched them. Elijah? Yeah, Elijah was told to preach to the field of dead bones, and what happened to all of them?
God rebuilt them.
Yeah, and apparently two different armies. Well, I say two armies because, if you got a battlefield, you got to have at least two armies. They all came back to life. So we do have other notable exceptions. But as a rule, the Bible tells us it is appointed for man once to die. Not twice, not three times. Well, guess what? Moses had his turn, about 3,000 years ago. So Moses would have to himself be resuscitated or resurrected. And again, we know it's not a resurrection because what happens after those two witnesses prophesy for a while? So we're told they're killed and their dead bodies lay in the street for 3 days. And then they are resurrected. I don't think it's Moses simply because of the fact that Moses is already dead. But we have two people in the entire history of the world that never died. Elijah we know is one, and the other is Enoch. And all during the tribulation period, with the church gone, God's relationship with the world reverts back to the covenants with Israel because God has, He's got unfinished business with Israel. And that's one of the reasons why, again, the Bible tells us, and I'm convinced, that the church has to be removed before the tribulation period begins in order for God to finish His unfinished business with Israel. Well, if we are under that particular covenant during the tribulation period, look at it from this perspective. Elijah was a prophet to the people of Israel in what's called the post-exilic age. In other words, the Israelites, the Jews, had already been taken into captivity. They have come back, and Elijah was raised up as a prophet to teach the Jews how to worship after returning to their homeland. Well, guess what happens just before the tribulation period begins?
Jews return to their
The
homeland.
Jews return to their homeland. So God has raised up Elijah, or will raise up Elijah. Well, not raise up, but Elijah will return to once again prophesy to the Jews, having returned to their homeland. But there's another group of people that will also be present in the world during the tribulation period. Those are the Gentiles. Well, guess what? Before the flood, there were no Jews. Everybody was a Gentile. And guess who was the prophet to them? The prophet to the Gentile people during, or should say previous to the new covenant, well, there's only one. Enoch. And Enoch never died. That's why, again, I'm convinced that those two prophets during the tribulation period, Enoch and Elijah. And they then, at the end of their ministry at that point, will have their opportunity to experience a physical death, and 3 days later, they will be resurrected. All right. But now, verse 25 says, Methuselah lived 187 years and then became the father of Lamech. Lamech, 782. He had other sons and daughters. The days of Methuselah, 969 years, and he died. Now, how many times have you ever heard people say, well, Methuselah is the oldest person ever to live? We don't know that. All we know is Methuselah is the oldest one we have a record of. We have no way. It does not say Methuselah is the oldest person ever. He's just the oldest one we know about. All of these other people, these other sons and daughters, we don't know how old they were. So if you hear, if you're talking about Methuselah, don't make the mistake of just assuming or saying, oh, Methuselah was the oldest person, because he may or he may not have been. He's just the oldest one we know about. Lamech lived 182. He became the father of a son. Now he called his name Noah. So now we get back to the more than just this guy fathered this guy and lived this long. Now it gets a little bit more specific. Called his name Noah, saying, this one shall give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed. Interesting that Lamech, the father of Noah, names his son this word which actually means rest. How in the world does he know that Noah's going to give the land rest from the curse?
Prophecy.
Maybe. Or maybe, God told him something that, that he knew about that the others didn't.
Well, didn't God send messengers to explain things to Mary and Joseph?
He did. I'm not saying that he couldn't have. I'm just saying, however God did it, or whether God spoke to him directly, we don't know. Doesn't tell us. But he clearly knew something that the rest of them didn't know. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah. He had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Interesting that Lamech, the father of Noah, that's an interesting amount of time to die.
777.
777. Now, if Lamech had lived a normal lifespan as the others did over 900 years, then either Lamech would have had to have gotten on board the boat, or Lamech would have died in the flood himself. Because from the time he was born, 900 years later would have been after the flood. Verse 32, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, and it's interesting as well, All the others, it just says they had other sons and daughters. Noah had 3 sons, and we're told that was it. No others. Now, we're out of time for today, but we're going to pick up. We're not going to move on to chapter 6 yet on Wednesday. I've got something with regard to all of these generations that you will find interesting. And for those of you that are thinking that you've seen it before, no, I'm going to give you more than what you've seen before on this coming Wednesday that you will find is very interesting about all of these generations from Adam to Noah and how God revealed himself through each one of them. That's for Wednesday night. And then next Sunday, we'll move on to chapter 6. Questions this evening? Bruce.
Maybe you haven't got to, but surprised you haven't touched on Enoch as being a type of the rapture.
Which one?
Enoch as being a type of the rapture.
That's a possibility. The only problem where Enoch would fall short of being a rapture type is when we are raptured, there will be 2 events that will occur simultaneously. Those who are dead in Christ will be resurrected, and those who are still alive will be translated. But the point is, we will all immediately be given resurrection bodies. Enoch, as far as we know, didn't get that.
But I've heard, I couldn't tell you to swear, that Enoch is a type for the rapture, and then Noah in the ark is a type for Israel going through the tribulation.
That's a possibility, but again, that would be one of those things we can speculate about, but we don't really have scriptural evidence that we can put our thumb on it and say, absolutely, this is what happened. Does it point to that? I won't disagree with that. It could. We just don't know for sure.
You think a lot of Enoch's teachings could have been, Noah, this is his great granddaddy. Did you think any of that came across the flood through them?
Oh, I would hope so.
Yeah.
And then didn't Methuselah's name mean at his death shall bring?
We'll get to that on Wednesday.
Okay.
I haven't overlooked that. That's just the part we don't have time for tonight. But, and like I said, there's a few of them in here, like I know Sherry and Karen and Mac back there have seen this, what I'm going to cover on Wednesday, seen part of what I'm going to share Wednesday once before. But before you get complacent over there. And,
Yeah, I was gonna say,
it was before,
it was before yesterday, so.
yeah, we're going to cover all the meanings of each of those names, and I'm going to cover some stuff that if those 3 remember having covered this here about 3 or 4 years ago, yes, no, maybe.
4 years.
No.
I've been here 3.
Okay.
It happened yesterday, maybe.
Okay. All right, well, good. Well, it'll be completely new for you. Isn't it great to have Alzheimer's? You meet new people every day, multiple times.
And you go new places.
All right. Any questions? But yes, okay. To finish up, yeah, we're going to cover all the meanings of those names, and you're going to find that there's a lot of information in that, and makes you wonder that God definitely was involved.